joining us is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He's one of the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who did not vote for the resolution authorizing U.S. force against Syria. Senator Murphy, I want to start with you. You heard Jim allude to it, and I'm sure you saw the report itself about the Syrians trying to move weapons, these chemical weapons, around and get them out of the way of any potential inspectors. Does that sound, well, first of all, do you know anything about that beyond what we've read in the Wall Street Journal? And second of all, that doesn't really sound like a government that is ready to acquiesce to the world's demands.
Yeah, I mean, first, what we know is that Syria's been moving weapons around for a number of days, anticipating attack. What we also know is that we have a pretty good read on where they've been moving these weapons. It's hard to move them without U.S. surveillance being able to track them. Second, we also know Syria doesn't want to give up these weapons. Right. They're only going to do so if Russia tells them they have to, right? The only way that Assad continues in power in Syria is with the permission of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. So ultimately, he's going to do everything he can to try to subterfuge this deal. It's going to be Putin that's going to bring him to the table ultimately.
Do you trust Putin to do that?
Well, listen, I think Putin has two good reasons here. Clearly, the threat of force has made a difference here, but Putin wants to be a regional player. Russia's been off of the radar screen in terms of international influence for a long time, and Putin believes that he alone can bring them back into the sphere that they once were. If he is seen as an international pariah by standing by a guy that basically gasses his people, then he has no credibility. And a lot of the sort of former satellite nations and former republics of Russia will start to retreat to other zones of power and walk away from Putin. So I think he's got a lot of reasons why he needs to deliver on the promise that he and Lavrov have made here.
I just want to underscore this point, though. Syrians are moving chemical weapons around in Syria in anticipation of either strikes or now possible inspectors. And you don't think that Assad would have ordered that without Putin knowing about it?
I can't certainly say that Putin knew about it. What I know is that the Russians have a good sense of where these weapons are. Between U.S. intelligence and Russian intelligence, we can find these weapons no matter where Assad moves them. What we know is that they used to be spread out all over the country. They have been consolidated to a certain degree, so they're easier to find than they have been before.
So, you know, after 11 o'clock at night Eastern, you can tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Right, nobody's watching.
Just
tell us.
Just us kids. Everybody in the Obama administration says the only reason why this diplomatic process is going forward is because of the credible threat of force. You, as somebody who voted, one of the few Democrats, I think one of two Democrats who voted against using force in committee last week, would you agree that it was because it passed, even though you voted against it, that this diplomatic process is going forward?
No, I certainly can't deny that that's an element of the reason that the Russians have come to the table here.
So do you regret your vote?
So no, because if I wasn't being asked to vote on the threat of force. I mean, we were up to the point where we were being asked to actually vote on striking Syria. And I still, to this day, believe that that would not be in the U.S. national interest to strike Syria, even if these talks break down. For the United States to do that unilaterally, I think compromises us internationally, makes us look like the bully that we are not. Ultimately, I think it would make the situation worse on the ground for the Syrian people due to the strikes that Assad may then take against his own people, even with conventional weapons. And I think it's just hard to unwind the U.S. commitment there in a matter of months. I think we're probably dedicated to the commitment for years. But again, I think that the threat of force certainly is an element to why Putin came to the table here. But I think he had plenty of other reasons in terms of trying to establish and maintain international credibility to try to find a way out of this.
When you voted no, you said that part of the reason you voted against that resolution was because you objected to it, but you were still moved by it. And you said the look on his face reminded me of the look in his eyes when he came to Newtown shortly after the shooting. You're from Connecticut. And I know that he's moved here. I wonder what it says to you about the president's leadership style, that these are the two issues on which you've seen him most moved, and he actually could not get action on either of them.
Well, it's yet to be seen what the resolution of this is going to be. So it may be that ultimately we get those weapons out of Syria, and that is good news for the rest of the children who are still alive in Syria today. Yeah, I've watched him talk about these kids, and I really have been struck by a president who is just deeply, deeply concerned about the plight of children in this country and across the world. I just, again, worry that in an effort to try to protect from future chemical attacks in Syria, we may end up getting more people killed there.
With all due respect to the president's emotion, and I recognize that I'm not doubting the sincerity of it, 100,000 people have been killed in Syria before the number we've been given by the government is 1,400. Who knows what the actual number is? Certainly scores of children were killed, perhaps even 400. Many of the 100,000, that 100,000 can be parsed, and some of them are regime forces and some of them are rebels. A lot of them are innocent civilians and a lot of them are kids. Of the 100,000 already killed, I think that I understand the argument that chemical weapons are just beyond the pale. But why? Why, if you are moved to help kids, is the original 100,000? I think this is a question that a lot of Americans don't fully understand. What makes dying from sarin gas worse than dying from a bullet to the head if you're a 5-year-old?
Well, and I think that also speaks to how this conflict plays out, right? I think we've made it very clear that if Assad was to use chemical weapons a second time, that we would strike a second time. But if Assad was to turn around and take out a massive conventional weapons attack basically in return for the U.S. strike against his own people, then we likely wouldn't attack again. And so I think these are some of the very difficult questions that we have to ask, that there are some very terrible things that Assad could do after our strike that we might not actually step in and try to stop.
Can I ask you about sort of the operational theory here of the administration? It may or may not be, but what I've heard is that, for example, say these negotiations turn to garbage, doesn't work, he goes then back to Congress. Would you be more likely to vote for the authorization of force if all of this fails?
Probably not, because my objection was not simply the lack of international consensus or international effort. I really don't believe that this is in the U.S. national security interest to do, regardless of whether we have 6 players internationally helping us or whether we have 20.
So you think, and do you think that there are lots of people in the Senate who are like you? In other words, if the president were to go back to the Senate now, I mean, let's forget the House. That's a whole different story, much more difficult. But so do you think how this plays out would really not have an impact for him?
No, I think it could. I think there are a handful of members whose reluctance to sign on to this was simply due to the fact that I'm not one of them, that the president had not done his due diligence internationally. But I think there are plenty of members, I think the majority that are skeptical right now, who are skeptical not because of the lack of international consensus, but just because ultimately we worry that a strike could end up tying America up, our military, our treasure, for a matter of years, if not a decade. And that really has nothing to do with whether we do it alone or with other countries.
Senator Murphy.